Hi Simply Vegas agents. Today we're going to go through how to properly and correctly complete a residential purchase agreement. Important to remember, this is for houses. This is a residential purchase agreement. There is a separate vacant land purchase agreement if you are doing vacant land. Starting off at the top of the form, obviously the date is going to be today's date. And then this is where your buyer's information goes in as to how they're buying the property. If they're buying the property in the name of a trust or an LLC, that's what goes in here. Otherwise, it goes in their personal names. If they're husband and wife, both of their names need to go in here and they both need to be signing. Property address, self-explanatory. Extremely important to make sure the APN goes in here as well. If escrow is having an issue identifying a property, they're going to cross-reference the APN. And occasionally, we're going to have multiple parcels involved in a sale, in which case you would note both APNs there. Obviously, the purchase price goes in here. And then the financial terms, starting off with the earnest money deposit. That's the earnest money is obviously wired straight to escrow. And it's important to indicate at this section how that is getting over to escrow. If it's wired, there's a box for it that's checked along here, and that is upon acceptance. If you think your buyer is going to need a couple of days to get the wire done, spell out in this section 48 hours from acceptance. Otherwise, you will be out of contract if within 24 hours the wire hasn't arrived. If there is an additional deposit, and this is rare to see this paragraph, but if there is an additional deposit, that's going to be in a situation where the buyer is putting in more earnest money deposit after certain parts of the agreement have been reached. So again, doesn't get filled in very often, but that's where you would put it. Then if there's financing involved, it is extremely important to notate the type of financing and the approximate loan amount. Obviously, you are going to calculate the loan amount based on the down payment minus the earnest money deposit, and then that's going to give you the actual loan amount right here. And then putting in there, you need to specify things like if there is a maximum amount that an interest rate cannot exceed, you need to spell that out in here. If they are assuming an existing loan, that's going to be spelled out in here. There are very, very few loans left that are assumable. So it is extremely important to make sure that the lender will allow a loan to be assumed, and you need written permission from the lender in order to assume a loan. Very, very important. If it's a promissory note, this is when we're doing a seller carry. The amount gets put in there, but then we do the financing addendum separately, and all the terms of that promissory note get spelt out in the financing addendum. Last part here is the balance of the purchase price. So you're going to take the total price, you're going to minus the earnest money, you're going to minus the loan amount or the amount that's being carried, and the remainder is put in there as balance of purchase price. Obviously, every single page here needs to be initialed. When you put in the buyer's name at the top, it auto-fills the name of the property address in the bottom of these forms. Loan application. This is the time you need to spell out in order for your buyer to go and get a loan. From a seller's standpoint, a seller's going to want to see that your buyer has already been and got a pre-qualification letter. So most of the time, you're going to have that accompanying your offer, in which case you're just going to type in done in this paragraph, and then your accompanying pre-qualification letter will be attached to the offer. Appraisal contingency. This is the amount of time that your buyer and the bank has to complete the appraisal. So putting the time frame in here must be very, very clearly spelled out, not only to your buyer, but to your buyer's lender, because the appraisal needs to be completed prior to the end of that date. Otherwise, you will have to ask for an extension of the appraisal contingency. Very, very important that these dates do not get let slip. Loan contingency. This is an extremely important number, and please, 14 days is not long enough for a full loan contingency. Majority of the time, we're doing at least 30 days on that. Talk to your lender and have an honest to goodness conversation with your lender and say, what time frame can you guarantee me we're going to have full loan approval by, because you are going to have to ask for an extension on this. If it's a cash purchase, if the bank statement has not accompanied the offer, this is the space that you put in how many days before the bank statement will be accompanying it. Going down to the next portion of that, you're going to fixtures and personal property. A lot of the time, you're going to spell this out on a separate addendum. If there are things like furniture, etc., I do recommend you put those on a separate addendum rather than being on the bulk of this purchase agreement. However, there are things like all appliances and electronics to be included in the sale. If it's simple stuff, that goes in here, or spelling out the things that have been included per the MLS. A lot of the times I like to put as per ML and then the MLS number that this corresponds with. And you can attach the MLS printout sheet to this purchase agreement. Therefore, you have an exhibit as a reference for this paragraph. Putting your escrow officer at clear title over in this portion right here. And then obviously this tells your buyer exactly what's happening with the earnest money deposit. Close of escrow. This is the date on or before that you want closing to occur. Obviously, if it's a holiday or a weekend, then it gets extended to the next business day. It's also worthwhile looking at the calendar before you fill in this date to make sure it's not a holiday or a weekend. Obviously talks about title insurance, etc. Next is the due diligence portion. Okay, this is where you're indicating to the seller how long you have for due diligence period. If it is conditioned upon the various items, including inspection, etc., this means unequivocally, for any reason, the buyer can cancel the purchase agreement in the time frame that's set forth here. It can be for any reason or it can be for no reason. If you have marked this box, my preference is that you don't actually give a reason. You just go ahead and cancel. It's a lot easier to defend if you haven't given a reason than if you have, because a reason can be rectified. Going through, and something that we talked about on a different form, is the request for repairs. And a part of the due diligence period, we would like you to put in the additional terms section, which I'll get to in a second, that the time it takes for the seller to respond to the request for repairs, due diligence shall be automatically extended by. That covers you in not needing to go and ask for an extension of due diligence once you've sent the request for repairs over, if the seller hasn't responded in the appropriate time frame set forth here. It talks about the various things, property inspections, etc. Again, initials are very important in all of these. This talks about if you fail to cancel or resolve any objections, then your buyer is bound by the contract. So if you let a time frame lapse, then it will be deemed that your buyer accepted any due diligence period as being over. Talks about inspections. This is talking about the various inspections and who pays for them. Energy audit, it's as simple as going through and saying who's paying and who's not. If you're not doing one, waive it. More importantly, if it's something that's non-applicable, if you have a house that's on city sewer, don't put waived for a septic lid removal. There isn't one, so it's non-applicable. So just make sure you go through every single one of these and fill them in. A lot of the newer houses have solar. A lot of the newer houses have electronics. So that's an opportunity here in the other section to request a home automation inspection or something like that. Then we talked about the request for repairs, which has to be done on a specific form. We have a separate video for that if you're unsure as to how to complete that form. Talking about fees, again, all of these needs to be filled in one way or the other. The typical in the state of Nevada, escrow fees are 50-50. Transfer tax is typically paid for by the seller. Lender's policy is typically paid for by the buyer. Appraisal these days, and the guys who've been around for a while know it always used to be seller. These days it's shifted to buyer, but it can be either side on there. The owner's policy is typically paid for by the seller. But again, all of these things can be either. It's just important that they're specified. Going through to lenders and closing costs. If you're not asking for any closing costs to be paid for by the seller, type out none in here so everybody's really clear that there's no request for closing costs. If you are asking for closing costs, that can be a percentage or a dollar amount. You need to fill it in that section. Home protection plan. Extremely important if you are requesting a home protection plan that you spell out the maximum amount on the home protection plan and indicate who is providing it. It talks about the common interest communities, etc., that you will all review. One big mistake people make on here, CIC demand, that's the HOA package, and that is paid for typically by the seller. Very, very few communities have a capital contribution. A lot of people erroneously put in paid for by the seller, and then the seller asks you, how much is the capital contribution? It's easy to research. Every single MLS sheet has the phone number of the HOA, and you can call them and say, hey, do you guys have a capital contribution? If so, how much is it? It is typically paid for by a seller, but it can be on either side. A lot of the condo communities that have one, the original buyer bought into it and paid it, but then the sellers going on forward have ended up paying it from there. It's something for negotiation, but make sure you fill it in, and if there isn't one, don't. Then the transfer fees. Obviously, transfer fees are a large item these days. Very few communities charge less than about $500 in transfer fees. Need to indicate who's paying for those. The only imperative disorder that accompanies is a seller's real property disclosure form. That is required on every single one of our transactions. The next box is if something has been marked yes on the SRPD. So you can mark this either way. If the seller has marked on the SRPD that there is a construction defect, obviously you need to get all the information about the defect, including the construction defects claims disclosure at that time. So that's not as important if you do it immediately. You're going to notice on the SRPD once that's provided to you. If you represent a seller, it is extremely important to provide the SRPD. I believe the law says within 10 days of closing, you've got to get that SRPD sent over to the buyer straight away. From the other side of the transaction, if you represent the buyer, request the SRPD immediately so you can get that specific due diligence item dealt with, and you'll know before the property inspection or whether or not there is a problem or has been a problem with the property. Lead-based paint obviously only applying if the house was built before 12/31/77. And then going through, talking about the walkthrough. The number that you put in here is when you should be doing the walkthrough. So if you're doing a walkthrough day before, put 1 calendar day before. If you're doing it 3 days before, put 3 in there. Don't leave it blank. It is important to let the seller know when you plan on doing the walkthrough, which is when they need to be out by. Delivery of possession. This is when the closing is actually taking place, or if there's some kind of agreement to move in before or after, that's where you indicate it right there. If it's COE, that means when it actually records. It doesn't mean when your buyers sign and when your buyers send over the money. It means when it's actually recorded at the Clark County Recorder's Office. Going through the next paragraphs are all pretty self-explanatory and all stuff that I'm sure you know. This broker's compensation, this is where you indicate with the accompanying buyer's disclosure as to whether or not your buyer is going to be paying your transaction fee for you. If not, then it will not, but that's where you indicate it in there so escrow knows that there will be a transaction fee that is due from this client. This is all the verbiage and abbreviations that's used in the contract, and then going on through, again, various legalese, etc. These contracts are not automatically extended. If you need an extension, you have to get one in writing. If you let that extension, the close of escrow date expire, then you're putting your client in jeopardy. Also, these contracts are not assignable contracts. If you want to assign to an entity, an LLC or a trust, you need to do an addendum in writing that accompanies this at the time you make that decision if you don't know it at the time of writing the offer. If you have any addendums, you need to indicate what they are in this paragraph, and if there are additional terms such as the extension of due diligence period for the seller to respond to requests for repairs, that all goes in this additional term section here. And then going through, please complete all of this information here. All of your information representing the buyer goes in here. You also need to indicate whether or not you have an interest in this transaction. That's going right there. Please make sure that you indicate when you want the sellers to respond by. Sometimes this gets missed. It's very important that it goes in there. And then obviously this is the signature portion, needs to be dated and timed. Next portion is the seller's response, and you need to fill this information in here for the listing agent. You don't want to have to go and get this form re-signed, refilled in. You certainly can't write in here anything after it's all been completed. So it's imperative that you fill in that information right here. It's all available. It's all on the MLS. It's easy to find. Brokers' numbers, etc. can all be very, very easily found. Going through to licensee disclosure of interest. Again, on the MLS, there's going to be a Y or an R where it says, is there an ownership interest in the property? And you can fill that in for the listing agent saying that they do or do not have an interest in the property. Again, it should be disclosed on the MLS. Make sure you look for it. FIRPTA, Foreign Investors Real Property Tax Act. When you get this form back from the responding seller's agent, make sure that this has been completed and initialed. If it has not, you need to send it back. The onus falls upon a buyer in the event that FIRPTA is not collected at close of escrow, and that buyer is then going to call you and say, hey, what's this? You need to pay it. So make sure that that's completed and filled in correctly by the seller and the seller's agents. This is where the acceptance portion goes in, and then the signature portion on the seller's side. And that's it for the form. Thanks very much indeed.